In 1803, the trade ship Boston sailed into Nootka Sound. On board was a 19-year-old Englishman named John Jewett. He was a blacksmith, an occupation that would save his life.
I had never before beheld a savage of any nation. It may readily be supposed that the novelty of their appearance, so different from any people I had hitherto seen, excited in me strong feelings of surprise and curiosity. I was, however, particularly struck with the looks of their king, who was a man of a dignified aspect, about 6 feet in height and extremely straight and well proportioned. He had an air of savage magnificence.
His name was McQuina. He was a chief and a power broker. His village at Nootka had become a wealthy trading post in the 25 years since Captain Cook's visit. McQuina's people had come to depend on metal goods forged by the traders. But hatred festered between the natives and the whites. There had been arguments and violence, rapes and beatings, even murder. Then John Jewett's ship arrived. The captain of the Boston gave McQuina a fowling gun as a present. In return, McQuina gave him 9 ducks, but he broke the gun. McQuina was scolded like a careless child in front of his warriors.
He spoke not a word in reply, but his countenance sufficiently expressed the rage he felt, though he exerted himself to suppress it. And I observed him, while the captain was speaking, repeatedly put his hand to his throat and rub it upon his bosom, which he afterwards told me was to keep down his heart, which was rising into his throat and choking him.
The next day, McQuina was back, this time performing a dance for the assembled crew of the Boston, acting as if nothing had happened.
Over his face he wore a very ugly mask of wood, representing the head of some wild beast. He appeared to be remarkably good-humored and gay, entertaining us with a variety of antic tricks and gestures. I fell stunned and senseless upon the floor. I was, however, soon recalled to my recollection by 3 loud shouts or yells from the savages, which convinced me that they had got possession of the ship. It is impossible to describe my feelings at this terrific sound. I looked up to see savages standing in a circle around me, covered with the blood of my murdered comrades, with their daggers uplifted in their hands, prepared to strike. He then asked me if I would be his slave during my life, if I would fight for him in his battles, if I would repair his muskets and make daggers and knives for him, to all of which I was careful to answer, yes.
The Boston was emptied and scuttled. McQuina's men had cut off the heads of Jewett's fellow crew members and forced him to identify them one by one. Then McQuina held a potlatch. It was a feast, a dance, and a triumphant show of power, where a chief would welcome his guests by lavishing his excess riches on them.
I had determined from the first of my capture to adopt a conciliating conduct toward them and conform myself as far as was in my power to their customs and mode of thinking, trusting that the same divine goodness that had rescued me from death would not always suffer me to languish in captivity among these heathens.
Jewett was exposed to an unbelievable wealth of ancient nations, among them the Nootka, the Makah, the Haida, the Salish, and the Kwakiutl. They cut through the ocean in huge hand-carved cedar canoes. They were artists and dancers, mystics and whalers, headhunters and cannibals. They boasted great wealth, worshipped wolf spirits and thunderbirds. Jewett became a constant companion to Maquinna at Nootka and on his visits to other tribes. Summers turned into winters, and still no rescue ships came into the Sound. Meanwhile, to Maquinna, Jewett became less of a slave and more of a son, so much so that in time he arranged for Jewett to be married.
I remonstrated against this decision, but to no purpose, for he told me that should I refuse, I would be put to death.
A blacksmith from England, now a husband at Nootka. Jewett fell further into the world of Nootka Sound, succumbing to its customs and rhythms. He even came to comprehend the massacre of his crewmates on the Boston.
Here, I cannot but indulge a reflection that has frequently occurred to me on the manner in which our people behave towards the natives. For though they are a thievish race, yet I have no doubt that many of the melancholy disasters have principally arisen from the imprudent conduct of some of the captains and crews of the ships employed in this trade, in exasperating them by insulting, plundering, and even killing them on slight grounds. On the morning of the 19th of July, a day that will be ever held by me in grateful remembrance of the mercies of God, my ears were saluted by the joyful sound of 3 cannon and the cries of the inhabitants exclaiming, "Strangers, white men."
It was an American ship, the Lydia. Maquinna wanted to trade, but he feared retribution for the massacre of the Boston's crew. He could neither read nor write, so he turned to Jewett to compose a letter of introduction to the American captain.
He said, "John, you no lie."
But Jewett did lie. He wrote a rescue plea that sent Maquinna into a trap.
I found Maquinna in irons, with a guard over him. He looked very melancholy, but on seeing me, his countenance brightened up. I asked the captain's permission to take off his irons, assuring him that as I was with him, there was no danger of his being in the least troublesome.
Maquinna bartered some otter skins for a greatcoat. Then he made ready to leave the Lydia and Jewett.
I felt a sincere pleasure in freeing from fetters a man who, though he had caused the death of my poor comrades, had nevertheless always proved my friend and protector. Then, grasping both my hands with much emotion, as the tears trickled down his cheeks, He bade me farewell and stepped into the canoe, which immediately paddled him on shore. Notwithstanding my joy at my deliverance, and the pleasing anticipation I felt of once more beholding a civilized country, and again being permitted to offer up my devotions in a Christian church, I could not avoid experiencing a painful sensation on parting with this savage chief who had preserved my life. And in general, treated me with kindness.
John Jewett never shook the effects of his time among the Nootka. He wrote a book about his adventure. He turned that into a song, then a play, and went around peddling his tale to anyone who would listen. It haunted him until he died at age 37. Years later, a French trader sailed into Nootka Sound. It was quiet, except for the approach of an aging, arthritic man in a canoe. He was carrying a small load of otter pelts. He was McQuina, and he was still eager to trade.